So, gun laws, or a lack of them, are in the spotlight yet again in the United States. It comes after 18-year-old Salvador Ramos killed 19 children and 2 teachers in one of the worst mass shootings in U.S. history. The youngest victims of the school shooting were as young as 9. We're asking you what you think in our question of the day, and to discuss, we're now joined by Cheryl Dorsey, who is a retired LAPD sergeant. She's a gun reform activist and the author of Black and Blue, the creation of a social advocate. Sergeant Dorsey, thank you for being with us. The whole world is shocked again. You can really bring a unique perspective as a former law enforcement officer. My first question is, do you think this mass shooting could have been avoided, and how?
Absolutely, it could have been avoided. I mean, if we had stricter gun regulations, I believe that certainly would have been helpful. Had the family of this gunman notified authorities, when you see something, when you know something, you should certainly say something. And we now know that as far back as September of 2021, this gunman had asked his sister to purchase a weapon for him, and waited then, when she refused, until his 18th birthday to go and buy his first assault rifle. And then a couple of days later, it's reported he went and bought yet another, and massive amounts of ammunition. And so understanding a little bit about who this gunman is, the fact that he's a high school dropout, makes me think that he's probably incorrigible, living with his grandparents, one of whom he shot in the face, his grandmother, probably has no respect for authority. And I think there were red flags that were ignored.
Talking about the gun laws, I mean, we don't understand it here. So I understand in Texas specifically, you don't even need a license now to own a handgun. He had a semi-automatic rifle. You said he was just waiting to turn 18. What do the gun laws mean for an 18-year-old with vicious intent?
Well, all you have to do is be 18 in Texas, and the governor over there, Greg Abbott, who is facing election. We're in the midst of a midterm election, and I'm hopeful that the Texans will do the right thing, because this governor doesn't have the appetite to do that. And we've heard him speak since this shooting and try to minimize and mitigate what had happened, try to infer that somehow this had something to do with mental illness. And we know that it had nothing to do with mental illness. He has promised to put some things into place pending this shooting that might be helpful. Mental health counselors, monies for the family so that they can get medical help, none of which would stop another incident like this. And so part of what has to happen here in the US is that we have to get rid of these elected officials who don't have the intestinal fortitude to really pass substantive gun legislation.
Would Ramos have gone through any sort of psychological evaluation or anything like that before being given this gun?
Not necessarily, because there was nothing that would indicate that he was problematic, in terms of he had no criminal history. He had never been diagnosed with any kind of mental illness. So only the family would have been intimately familiar with his musings, with his thought process. It's reported that he had been on social media, and there were people that he had been communicating with in chat rooms that might have been helpful. If we had a place, if we had a liaison person where we could go and report things that don't rise to criminality, that don't mean someone has a mental illness situation, but would give an investigator who's doing a background pause and maybe ask a few more questions, maybe delay the handing over of an assault rifle. But we don't have that in place right now. And so these red flag laws need to be revamped and strengthened, in my opinion.
And according to you, that means there's another mass shooting just around the corner, basically.
Well, listen, I mean, since 2012 with the Sandy Hook shooting, where there were over 20 toddlers killed in a daycare, if that didn't outrage and move elected officials and so-called civil rights leaders here in the US to act, why would we be surprised that we're almost a decade later still facing the same issue?
All right, so you're saying it's no coincidence that the US, that has some of the most lax gun laws, is the same place where we see an incredible amount of mass shootings. 1 in every 3 American adults owns a gun. I mean, people around the world are looking at statistics. Just tell us about some of your personal experiences. This is a very tightly held right by some Americans. How easy do you think it will be to shift things in a place like Texas, to introduce tighter gun regulation? Because many are crying out for it, but it never happens.
Well, part of the problem is that we have a governor in Greg Abbott in Texas who has no appetite to change laws. And even in the midst of this tragedy, Greg Abbott and Senator Ted Cruz, also in Texas, appeared virtually, but they made sure that they appeared nonetheless at the NRA, National Rifle Association's meeting that was held just over the weekend. I mean, so these guys want to have their cake and they want to eat it too. The NRA is very powerful. They pay tremendous amounts of monies into the coffers and campaigns of these elected officials. And rather than cancel this event over the weekend, rather than not appear, Governor Greg Abbott showed up and talked down the atrocity that happened at Uvalde.
It's incredible. Tell us what you think about the reports that have come out since this mass shooting. Reports suggesting that children were calling 911, but officers were waiting outside in a hallway. They didn't enter the classroom. They waited nearly an hour. Apparently, the rule is that you should confront an active shooter. Some confusion there. How are you looking at it as a former officer?
There were a compilation of errors in this instance. And when we think about police departments, most people probably think large agencies like LAPD or NYPD, but this was a small police department over in Uvalde. There was only 6 police officers on that department. So you can imagine that they were overwhelmed by this kind of an incident, probably have never dealt with even a homicide, let alone a mass shooting. So they were relying on the assistance of other agencies who ultimately did come in and assist. But you had a police chief from that school district who probably was ill-equipped to handle this kind of a situation. And he was the incident commander. He was the one who was responsible for telling those other agencies, I'm told about 6 others who were there standing outside of the classroom for over 45 minutes, not to enter, not to go in, a violation of their own policy, procedure, and protocols. And so there needs to be accountability. Heads need to roll, and there need to be officers who were on scene held accountable, because even though you may have a police chief telling you not to act, if the procedures call for you to engage an active shooter, then you should do that. And those officers should be also held accountable.
Yeah. Does the evidence suggest they were hearing gunshots and they didn't go in?
I don't know that to be true, but I would imagine, understanding that guns make a lot of noise, and if they were outside the door, that leads me to believe that they had to know. What we do know, what's being reported, is that children inside of the classroom who happen to have cell phones were calling the police, calling the 911 dispatcher and asking them to send officers, telling them what was going on real time. Certainly the dispatcher would have been able to hear the chaos in the background. And so it's problematic all the way around. And now we know that the Department of Justice is going to do an investigation, but all they do is make a recommendation. We know what happened. We don't really need DOJ. We had 19 cowards standing on the outside of that door, allowing children to be slaughtered in their presence.
Yeah, sure. Last question for you, Sergeant. The whole debate around gun laws coming up, and this is also linked to concerns that people of different race groups are confronted differently in the United States if they are armed. I'm interested to know what it was like for you to be a police officer who's also a member of a minority group that is often allegedly targeted by cops in the States.
We know that police officers deal with Black folks very differently. We've seen it time and time again. And so for me, it was never problematic. I was never ambivalent about how to conduct myself as a police officer, because first, I'm a Black woman. I'm a mother of 4 young Black men at that time. And so I was very clear on how I was going to deal with the community. I know, after having spent 20 years on the Los Angeles Police Department, all in patrol, that there's a way to do your job professionally, ethically, responsibly, and allow people to have their dignity, even while you take bad guys into custody, even when you deal with confrontational, combative suspects, violent suspects. It's doable. I did it. And to hear otherwise being offered as an excuse is unacceptable.
All right, thank you very much. Very interesting to talk to you tonight. That was Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, gun reform activist, retired LAPD officer, saying that gun laws in the United States have to change.